So I'm going to talk tonight about the war between Christianity and science. When we think about faith and science in our modern world, there's a lot of issues that come to mind. We think of things like creation evolution issue. We think about issues of sanctity of life, end of life, dignity, and beginning of life dignity, abortion and euthanasia. We think about the utilization of human embryos to harvest stem cells. We think about radical environmentalists and animal rights people who are trying to tell us that we are all equally valuable as a dog or a cat or a fish or a salamander. And at the root of that all, then, there's this attitude that science is basically naturalistic or atheistic. Naturalistic being materialistic, basically. The material world that we see is all that there is, and there is no spirit world. And atheism, of course, no God. And lots of atheists take great advantage of this. These are just some famous examples of atheists who are using their platform as scientists or former scientists to promote a very atheistic, anti-faith agenda. Jerry Coyne, in particular, being one of the more recent ones here, why science and religion are incompatible. The fundamental incompatibility of faith and science, which, as a Christian and a scientist, is kind of odd because I've lived it all my life, so hearing about how I can't exist is really weird. And we have plenty of examples here locally. Right up the street here, we had the Scopes monkey trial, where the town folk fake prosecuted some guy for allegedly teaching evolution, which he probably never did. But we had a big trial, and lots of people came, and the world paid attention to us for a short period of time. And we basically became the laughingstock. Every time someone wants to talk about dumb fundamentalists, it's Dayton that they drag out, and it's very unfortunate. But this is yet another example of one of those faith versus science issues. This all goes back not very far. These two guys here, John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White, introduced what historians call the conflict thesis. And the conflict thesis was introduced in their two books. This one here is our Core Academy's copy of the history of the conflict between religion and science. And then we just recently acquired first edition of White's massive 2-volume history of the warfare of science with theology in Christendom. Very important. Lots of pages in here, lots of words, lots of footnotes. It certainly seems like a very scholarly volume. So I'll leave those there if you want to have a glance through them after the talk. Draper was a Wesleyan preacher's kid from Lancashire, England. He moved to America before he went to medical school and eventually became a chemistry professor and a pioneer in early photography. He is the recorded person who was the first to photograph a woman's face back in the early 1800s. Spent 41 years at New York University, eventually serving as president. And in 1874, he published his History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, in which he said this: "Then has it in truth come to this, that Roman Christianity and science are recognized by their respective adherents as being absolutely incompatible. They cannot exist together. One must yield to the other. Mankind must make its choice. It cannot have both." A reconciliation of the Reformation with science is not only possible, but would easily take place if Protestant churches would only live up to the maxim taught by Luther and established by so many years of war. That maxim is the right of private interpretation of scriptures. In other words, So long as you don't tell me what the Bible means, then we'll all get along. But if you try to tell me what the Bible means, then we're in for a fight. And that's what Draper here charged Roman Catholicism with doing, basically enforcing dogma on the world. Andrew Dixon White, born in New York to a businessman, baptized Episcopalian, studied at Yale and in Europe, became a historian. He was an ambassador for a while. He was a politician, and eventually he helped start Cornell University, and he served at its very first president. And in 1896, he published A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, where he writes, in all modern history, interference with science in the supposed interest of religion, no matter how conscientious such interference may have been, has resulted in the direst evils both to religion and to science, and invariably. And on the other hand, all untrammeled scientific investigation, no matter how dangerous to religion, some of its stages may have seemed for the time to be, has invariably resulted in the highest good of both religion and science. In other words, every time that religion has tried to butt into science, it's been the worst possible evil. But every time science has butted into religion, it has been the greatest possible good. Interesting. Now, a few observations about these books here. Both books are heavily anti-Catholic, and in fact, Draper's is obviously written, he just basically says it right in the introduction. He gripes about the First Vatican Council in 1869 to 1870, and how that council established what we now know as papal infallibility, the idea that when the Pope speaks with the full authority of the Church on a doctrinal matter, that he cannot make a mistake. And so Draper's book is very much a reaction against that doctrine. As for White's book, massive 2-volume, many footnoted book, a historian of science, James Joseph Walsh, in 1908, wrote a rebuttal. So this is like just a few years after it was published. The story of the supposed opposition of the Church and the popes and ecclesiastical authorities to science in any of its branches is founded entirely on mistaken notions. Most of it is quite imaginary. Only those who know nothing about the history of medicine and of science continue to harbor it. So what is the actual story? Is science and Christianity, are they at war or not? Well, when we look back into the history of science, both of these guys made a big deal about how the early church fathers argued against, somewhat vigorously, Greek philosophy, which is true. If you read many of the early church fathers' works, many of them just start with the word against. Against this person, against that person. It's remarkable how many things they were against. And yet, it is important to remember when we think about ancient Greek culture that these guys weren't necessarily scientists. What they think of as, what we think of as natural philosophy, or science, was in fact blended in with a lot of wild speculation and dogma that really today we would not recognize as science. Today we think of science as being experimental and based on observations, and there was plenty of that in Greek philosophy, but there was also plenty of the other stuff where basically they said circles are the most ideal thing, and so everything moves in a circle. So if you look up into the sky, all the orbits of everything that you see must be circular. That was just dogma, because they just assumed that it must be circular. It wasn't really based on observation. So just blindly defending Greek philosophy against the early church fathers is really not really defending science. You're also defending one ideological dogma against a different sort of ideological dogma. And in fact, when you look carefully at the fathers, you will find examples of support for science. So for example, here's an extended quote from Augustine, rather famous too. There is knowledge to be had, after all, about the earth, about the sky, about the other elements of this world, about the movements and revolutions, or even the magnitude and distances of the constellations, about the predictable eclipses of moon and sun, about the cycles of years and seasons, about the nature of animals, fruits, stones, and everything else of this kind. And it frequently happens that even non-Christians will have knowledge of this sort in a way that they can substantiate with scientific arguments or experiments. Now, it is quite disgraceful and disastrous that they should ever hear Christians spouting what they claim our Christian literature has to say on these topics, and talking such nonsense that they can scarcely contain their laughter. Does that sound like a guy who's opposed to science? No, he's admitting, yeah, you can predict eclipses. That's a very scientific thing to do. Go out and observe the sky and track the motion of the sun and the moon and know when the eclipses are going to happen. That's impressive stuff. And we should pay attention to that, Augustine says. And this is Augustine. If you don't know Augustine, he's like this towering figure in Western theology. He's huge. He had a massive influence on the church after him. So, on the one hand, yes, he did say things like, some knowledge isn't useful for theology, so it isn't something Christians ought to be pursuing. On the other hand, he also said valuable things about science, that we ought to take what we can from it. We ought to think carefully about it, and we ought not to just ignore it and say dumb things about it. But what about the Dark Ages, the medieval church?
So in the Middle Ages, science and really all natural, non-theological, natural philosophy, logic, and everything was considered to be a sort of handmaiden of theology. It was subservient to the needs of theology. So it was valuable insofar as it helped you think more about God or learn more about God or your own condition or salvation or whatever. So it was the handmaid. It was a servant of theology.
And so there was something of a discouragement to just go after science for any old reason. It had to be relevant to the Bible. So one thing that was relevant to the church was calculating the proper date of Easter. And that meant you had to have a really good calendar. And to have a really good calendar, you've got to make astronomical observations. So astronomy actually thrived pretty well through the Middle Ages because people were constantly working out the date of Easter. And they would make these big giant tables. They would go for 100 years or so. And that would chart out exactly when each Easter is going to happen. And it was elaborate. I mean, if you know anything about calendars, it's crazy. We have leap years, right? Every 4 years we add a day to the calendar. Well, in the Middle Ages, they could have leap months. They would have years where there were 13 months because it matched up to the lunar cycle. And so the lunar cycle doesn't match up to the solar cycle, so every now and then you have to throw in an extra month. And that was all established by astronomers and people doing all this crazy math that I could never do because they didn't even have calculators. I mean, I could probably figure it out with a computer, but I wouldn't want to have to do it by hand. That's crazy. And they literally did it by hand. I read a treatise on this recently, and he starts off with explaining how to count on your fingers. And it's not just 1, 2, 3, but you lower one finger to represent this, and there's various signs that you use to represent different numbers, and then you put your hands together and you can do math. I can't even imagine trying to do science like that. It's amazing. I'm so thankful for calculators. Anyway, but that's digression. There was science in the Middle Ages. It happened. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't conflict, of course. In the 12th century in particular, we had an influx of Arabic translations of ancient Greek philosophers. So Aristotle was reintroduced to Europe, Western Europe, that had largely forgotten about Aristotle. Plato came too. And there was this attitude of excitement. People were excited to talk about all that Aristotle had done because Aristotle had done enormous things. He had written this giant catalog of describing all the animals and all the plants, and he had this massive body of work that influenced medicine and zoology and all sorts of fields. But that influx of ideas also brought with it some ideas that were problematic and led to what we call the condemnations of 1277, which were 219 statements that were declared to be erroneous, formally erroneous, possibly heretical, definitely out of bounds, something that you were not allowed to believe and not allowed to hold. And again, those statements were sort of equivocal. Are they scientific statements or are they not? So one of the things that they said you couldn't do was to claim that the earth was eternal. Aristotle had said the earth was eternal, and so now the bishop in Paris says you can't say that. You cannot say that the earth is eternal. And scientists today, is that a matter of observation? Can you observe the eternal nature of the earth? No. So is that really science, or is that just Aristotle speculating and guessing about how the earth was? Well, that's a good question. Another thing that was formally condemned was the idea that human beings had also been eternal and did not come from two original progenitors. Obviously, that is a doctrinal point in the book of Genesis, right? And yet at the same time, how would Aristotle know that, right? How would Aristotle know that humanity had been here forever and had not originated from two individuals? Again, we have speculations in Aristotle that aren't necessarily scientific. So just defending Aristotle again against the church as being just science versus faith, it doesn't fit the way we think about science and faith today. It's a whole different world back then, with different concerns and different thoughts that don't easily translate into our modern concerns. I remember reading a book on the primitive originations of man, published in 1600s somewhere. And 2/3 of it was consumed with arguments for why humanity originated from a single pair of individuals. And at first, this is the first time I'd read something like that, and I was completely baffled why he would spend 2/3 of the book arguing about that. But obviously, Aristotle didn't think that was the case, so it suddenly makes sense, right? All right, so from there, we get to the scientific revolution. 1543 is traditionally understood as the beginning of that scientific revolution. Copernicus published his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres in that year. It was the first point at which the modern world really began to seriously consider heliocentric views of the solar system. The idea that planets are going around the sun, and the Earth is one of those planets. That would prove controversial. Vesalius also published his book on the fabric of the human body the same year. Vesalius gets a lot less credit, but he should get as much credit as Copernicus. Vesalius was arguing against ancient anatomy, basically. His book is essentially corrections of Galen, who was an ancient anatomist who basically set anatomy as a science throughout the Middle Ages. So everyone would defer to Galen, even though when they actually got the chance to dissect some poor criminal or homeless person who had died, they would always find discrepancies between what Galen said was supposed to be there and what was actually in the bodies. And so they would blame it on the guy doing the cutting and saying, you must have mangled everything because Galen couldn't possibly be wrong, right? And Vesalius comes along, dissects a bunch of bodies and says, no, Galen is actually wrong. And so he writes this up and says, you know what? It's better to actually see things and check them out for yourself than to just take Galen's word for it. It was enormous. It became the new natural philosophy, the new philosophy. The idea that we don't simply gain knowledge by reading the works of previous authorities on subjects. We gain natural knowledge by going out and checking things out for ourselves. What a radical idea. It seems so obvious to us, right? So incredibly obvious to us because we've been raised in the scientific world. We think like that. So of course we would go and do an experiment to find out the answer to a question. These guys, they would go and try to look it up in Aristotle or Galen or somebody else, which seems so utterly counterintuitive to us. Now, historian Peter Harrison has argued that, in fact, the scientific attitudes that check it out for yourself and this idea that nature is accessible and understandable goes back to attitudes that came out of the Protestant Revolution. So here we have the actual doors in Wittenberg. 500 years ago, Martin Luther is said to have nailed the 95 Theses on the doors of the church at Wittenberg. And what started Luther down this path of clashing with the Pope? The Pope, who was supposed to be able to have the power to send him to hell if he did not conform to what the Pope said was the proper theology. Well, Martin Luther started reading Romans. He started checking it out for himself. That's familiar, isn't it? That's exactly what those scientists would do in the coming years. They would start thinking, we could just check this out for ourselves. And that became sort of the battle cry of the scientific revolution. The oldest scientific organization in the world is the Royal Society of London. And their motto is a Latin phrase that translates to, don't take anybody's word for it. And it's been that way since they started. Don't take anybody's word for it. Check things out for yourself. That was the thing that made the scientific revolution the scientific revolution. And it goes very much right back in spirit to what the Protestants were doing. Don't just take the Pope's word for it. Read the Bible for yourself. And the idea that, Martin Luther whipped out this German translation of the Bible was heretical. Why would you put the Bible into the modern language and the common language of the common people? They'll start reading it and getting crazy ideas because they can't understand it, says the Pope. Well, guess what? I don't think that's right. I think we've learned a lot of things by checking things out for ourselves. So what is the problem then? Why is it that we always have this notion that science and faith are intrinsically opposed and incompatible and always at war? Even today, we have this idea that these scientists are always out to do something, and we gotta hold their feet to the fire, make sure they're not going off on the deep end. Two incidents stick out in everybody's account. And everybody who talks about how Christianity is the enemy of science, they talk about these two guys, Galileo and Charles Darwin. And of the two, I think Galileo is probably more important, believe it or not. Little timeline here of Galileo's life. 1609 was when Galileo first started making telescopes and checking things out for himself. Pointing his telescopes up at the sky and seeing what he could see. What's out there? He looked at Jupiter. He saw the moons of Jupiter, which was radical. No one had ever seen that before. He looked up at the moon. He noticed that it has craters in it and hills and mountains, a lot like we have here on the Earth. We have hills and valleys. There's hills and valleys up on the moon. He looked at Venus. He saw that Venus has phases, just like the moon has phases. So there's you can see a sliver of Venus sometimes, and other times you can see a quarter Venus, and then sometimes Venus is full, and sometimes you can't find it at all. So Venus looks like it's acting like the moon. And Galileo got really excited about the things that he saw, and he began to forcefully argue for the Copernican view, the idea that the Earth is a planet that goes around the sun. Now, there were plenty of people at the time who believed that the Bible taught that the Earth does not move, and that the Earth is the center of everything, and that the sun goes around the Earth. And so there was growing concern that what Copernicus was proposing was actually formally incorrect. It was formally erroneous. And in 1615, things all sort of came to a head. Early in the year, the Inquisition received its first complaint against Galileo. And in the summer of that year, Galileo began circulating a document called the Letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. We'll look at what was in that here momentarily. By the end of the year, Galileo was summoned to Rome and warned in 1616 not to hold or to teach Copernicanism. And for years, he did exactly that. The Pope told him not to, the Inquisition told him not to, he didn't do it. Eventually, he got permission from his bishop to write a book comparing the two systems, a dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. He was comparing this geocentric idea with the heliocentric idea and trying to see, which one was a better fit to the observations of nature. And unfortunately, his enthusiasm came right through, and everybody knew what he really thought, because he couldn't really disguise it very well, even though he was trying to pretend like he was writing an objective evaluation. Yeah. So the Inquisition came back and told him that he was basically condemned, and they required him to recant, which he did, and that was it. He remained under house arrest until his death. But again, it's not like he's shackled up. He's basically just not allowed to leave the house. All right, so what was in this life of Galileo that made him so controversial? Well, the first thing that was problematic with Galileo is that he wrote in Italian. Everybody was supposed to write in Latin if you were a scholar, because other scholars could read Latin, and the common folk couldn't read Latin. So there wasn't any chance of confusing them when you're talking about really complicated things that might deceive the common folk. So you were supposed to keep the common folk out of scholarly arguments like this by only conducting them in Latin. And Galileo just went right in and wrote in Italian. And it seemed like he was bypassing the authority of the church to tell people what was the right thing to believe and listen to. So that was problem number one. Problem number two, Galileo was really, really, really insistent. He always got the last word. And that really annoyed a lot of people, as you can imagine. Somebody, most of us know some person who you just can't argue with because they will never, they're like bulldogs, they won't let go and they won't leave you alone and they will always have some counter argument to you, and it's just tiresome after a while. You just want to stop, just stop. That was Galileo. He was very, very forceful in the way he argued. The next thing to think about here is that this evidence about Copernicanism, this notion of the Earth going around the sun, was actually equivocal. It could go either way. And this is not well recognized, I think. For Galileo, when Copernicus wrote his book, the mathematics that he adopted was essentially the same mathematics as used in the old system. He assumed there were circular orbits, which doesn't work, so you have to do all these weird fudge factors to make it work. But not until Kepler came along with his laws of planetary motion and said, no, the orbits aren't circular, they're ellipses. They're like egg-shaped orbits. And suddenly people said, oh, that works much better. Now we don't have to have all those silly fudge factors in there. Ah, this makes sense. This was happening about the same time that Galileo was getting in trouble with the Inquisition. Although we don't have any evidence that Galileo really seized on Kepler's laws of motion. Kepler was an odd bird. He was very, very devout and religious, and wrote in very odd ways. And interesting fellow. But anyway, so basically at the time, the evidence for which one was right was equivocal. Galileo was very excited about the one because he thought it worked better in certain ways, but mathematically they were equivalent, and it wasn't clear which one was really right. So is the church really fighting against science? It's a good question. And the most important thing here is that Copernicanism was only condemned after Galileo wrote the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. Remember, Copernicus published his book in 1543. It wasn't until 1616 that the Inquisition said, nope, he's wrong. That's a long time to be able to talk about this. Scholars could talk about it and think about it and debate. And finally then, in 1616, the Inquisition came along and said, no, that's not right. So what was it about this letter that got Galileo in such trouble? Well, here's what it was. This is from the letter. It is necessary for the Bible, in order to be accommodated to the understanding of every man, to speak many things which appear to differ from the absolute truth, so far as the bare meaning of the words is concerned. But nature, on the other hand, is inexorable and immutable. She never transgresses the laws imposed on her, or cares a whit whether her abstruse reasons and methods of operation are understandable to men. For that reason, it appears that nothing physical, which sense experience sets before our eyes, or which necessary demonstrations prove to us, ought to be called in question, much less condemned, upon the testimony of biblical passages, which may have some different meaning beneath their words. Well, that's a lot of complicated talk. What in the world is he saying? He is saying here, it is necessary for the Bible. This isn't merely something that we can talk and debate about. This is absolutely required, that the Bible be put into language that people can understand. The Bible communicates all sorts of things that aren't strictly, literally true. Talks about the face of God, he says. Talks about the hands of God. God is a spirit. He doesn't have a body. So, strictly speaking, that's just figurative language, says Galileo. And because that happens, we never can quite know whether the Bible is figurative or literal. Therefore, when nature comes along, which is inexorable and immutable, that means it doesn't change, it's always the same, and we are able to understand it, we see physical things that sense experience sets before our eyes. In other words, things that we've established through science, those things must be true. They must necessarily be true. There cannot be error in science. Ergo, the Bible must be figurative if there is a conflict. This was called accommodation. Now, imagine you are a Catholic bishop, cardinal, perhaps even the Pope. At this time, here's Galileo. He is not a theologian. He is not anything in the Catholic Church at all other than a layperson in the Catholic Church. And now Galileo has come along and told you not only how you might be able to interpret the Bible, but how you must interpret the Bible. And what do you know? Galileo puts his stuff, science, above it and says the Bible must be interpreted according to what I say from my science. How do you think a Catholic official would think about that? Well, it wasn't very favorable, and that's what led to Galileo's trouble. Is it really the science that got him in trouble? I don't think so. What got him into trouble was his theology. Galileo was arguing for a particular kind of theology, not against theology itself. In fact, Galileo wouldn't have any conception of the idea of putting science up against theology. That's not even a category that he would have thought of in that day. He was advocating a theology. This is how we ought to interpret the Bible. And the Pope said resoundingly, no, not going to do that. And the other thing that's really important here is that Galileo is obedient. When the Inquisition told him to stop it, he stopped. That was it. Now, technically speaking, the dialogue was permissible under the ban of advocating or believing in Copernicus' ideas. But his enthusiasm for them, he just couldn't disguise it. So long as he was being perfectly unbiased and objective and came out to the right answer at the end, the one that the church said was right, then everything was okay. But he just was too excited about the new idea. But here's the thing. Galileo's theology fundamentally changed the landscape of the way people thought about knowledge. Prior to Galileo, science was a handmaiden of theology. So science could contribute things to help theology understand stuff. And of course, theology got to tell science, okay, that's definitely out of bounds. An eternal earth? No, can't say that. People not coming from two original progenitors? That's out. That's not acceptable. After Galileo, then, this went away. Galileo says, nope, the Bible might be accommodated on that point. It might be figurative. And if it is figurative, you shouldn't use the Bible to condemn science. So this channel of speaking went away. And the only channel left was science speaking to theology. Now, why in the world would anyone agree to that? Well, lots of reasons. One of which was Protestants really liked rebelling against the Pope. So here was this poor guy abused by the Pope and persecuted by the Pope, so he became kind of a folk hero, right? And everybody liked him up in the Protestant countries. This is great. They smuggled his writings out, and you know, the Inquisition's trying to stamp out his heretical books, the Dialogue, right? And yet, people smuggle it up north, and the Protestants would print it, and they loved it. They thought it was great. But here's the other thing. The thing that really made this appealing was this notion that you could have an independent science. That if you did science without being biased by what was written in the Bible, then you would come up with truth that would support the Bible. It was an independent witness to the truth of the Bible. Well, that makes some amount of sense, doesn't it? Some of them even believed that you could create a natural religion. Using science and evidence and logic, you could come up with a natural religion just inferred from nature and logic that would be Christianity. This is an example of one of those. This book is The Principles and Duties of Natural Religion. It's written by John Wilkins, in which he argues that we could put together a religion that is essentially the same as Christianity using logic and scientific evidence, not using the Bible. Seems so utterly odd to me. But that is what they thought. So there was something of a divorce there at the very start of science, right? Science starts in 1543, modern science starts in 1543, and by 1615, we've got this formal idea that the Bible shouldn't be used to refute scientific ideas. Now, the geologists had the first sort of skirmish in what followed. The geologists came along and said, you know, I think geology, rock layers, and that sort of thing would be much easier to explain if the Earth was really a lot older than we think. And at the same time, they also proposed specific ways that you might read Genesis that would allow you to think that that was true. So, for example, they came up with this idea that the ages in the days in Genesis 1, the days of creation, are really long ages of time that are describing the great periods that they've discovered, or they think they've discovered, from the fossil record. And so there was a bit of a skirmish. There were people who were very unhappy with what some of the geologists were doing, but it was pretty small because people said, okay, that's fine. They were following along with accommodation. Science has shown us that the Earth is really, really old, and so we've come up with this new way of reading Scripture. Plus, they still had Paley's design. These two guys here are pioneers of the design argument. This is John Ray and William Paley. These guys argued that the amazing features of organisms, animals, and plants, mostly animals, spoke of a wise designer who gave these creatures the abilities to do what they do. Classic example, the woodpecker. The woodpecker has an amazing skull that allows it to whack its head into solid wood extremely rapidly without causing a concussion. It has a tongue that's really that's wound up like a spring and shoots out really fast. The tongue has little bony barbs on the end of the tongue so that it can spear little bugs. The feet of the woodpecker are crazy. It's got 2 toes that go backwards and 2 toes that go forwards so that it's very easy for the woodpecker to hold on to the tree and climb up and peck wood. And so they said, that's not going to happen by chance. That must have been designed. This shows that God is good and kind and wants the woodpecker to peck wood and eat bugs. And so everybody was happy with that. This is it. The design argument makes sense of biology. This is why biology is the way it is. And then came the second big guy. And he took that away. And he said, now, there's something about the woodpecker that we got to remember here. If the woodpecker didn't have all those really cool features, we wouldn't be talking about them because they probably wouldn't be able to eat, and then they wouldn't survive, and then they wouldn't be around to be excited about. The only way for animals to be around so that we could marvel at how well designed they are is if they actually have these features, because if they don't, they would die out. That was natural selection. There's nothing, and Darwin said there's just nothing remarkable about the world that we see. It's remarkable in the sense of what natural selection can do, but it's not remarkable in the sense of, oh my goodness, God must have designed it. And that was something Christians couldn't take. They didn't like that idea at all. Up until this point, they've been pretty okay with scientific progress under accommodation. Geologists were all very nice and accommodating and provided new interpretations of Scripture. Darwin was an agnostic. He didn't really care about that. And he provided no way of understanding the Bible. He didn't really care. So there we have the emergence of what we think of now as this massive war between faith and science. So where does it come from? Well, science didn't want to be just a handmaiden. Scholars didn't want to just study science because it was useful to theology. Scholars wanted to study science for the sake of studying science, which makes sense to me. But Galileo came along, and in his enthusiasm for his ideas about the solar system, he introduced this notion that, because of the way the Bible has to be written, to make it understandable to everybody, we shouldn't be using it to tell us anything about science. And so he cut off the influence of theology on science. And then what happened next was sort of inevitable. Once you've sort of said, the Bible is out of bounds from science, well, guess what? Now we have a science that is it seems totally incompatible with Christian revelation. Billions of years old, Bible seems to say that things are recent. Humans evolved from animals. Bible talks about Adam and Eve. It's radically different. And it is no surprise to me when I go back to the beginning of science here and I realize they put the Bible out of bounds. So Darwin didn't come along and defeat Christianity. Darwin was merely the last little domino in a long line of dominoes. And if Darwin hadn't done it, somebody else would have. So now what? Do science and faith have to be enemies? Well, no, they do not. So how do they work together and be friends? Well, that's a much more complicated question that I would love to spend another hour talking about, but we'll have to do that 3 weeks from tonight on the next public lecture when I will tackle that very question. So, wrapping things up here on this tonight's subject, is there a battle between faith and science? You better believe it. You better believe it. There's definitely a battle today. And who is leading the battle? My reading of it is largely those hardcore atheists who want to tell you that there is a fundamental incompatibility of faith and science. When we look back historically at where this idea of the battle comes from, we find a lot of complications. It isn't nearly as clear-cut as everyone wants to tell you. It isn't simply a matter of faith versus science. Sometimes it's faith versus faith. More often than not, it's faith versus faith. It is ideologies clashing because they have different ideas of where knowledge comes from and how the world works. So next time, 3 weeks from tonight, February 20, we will talk about, or I will talk about, faith science, and especially how it pertains to creation here in the 21st century.